25 million people are in lockdown in Shanghai.
Troops have begun patrolling the streets of Australia's largest city, Sydney, to help enforce a prolonged lockdown.
South Africa has announced that it will be deploying more than 70,000 army troops to enforce a nationwide lockdown.
Sirens blare across the Jordanian capital, warning residents to stay in their home.
Curfew hours are in effect. You need to move now.
Police making multiple arrests.
We must declare war on this virus.
We must act like any wartime government.
We're at war.
We are in a situation of war.
We're at war with the virus.
Go home and stay home.
Stay at home and save lives.
You must stay at home.
Police will be stopping everybody who's leaving their home from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m.
If you don't follow the rules, the police will have the powers to enforce them.
I will not hesitate my soldiers to shoot you.
Things will get worse.
Masks should be worn outdoors, even when you're exercising. You need to have the mask with you.
All indoor and outdoor gatherings will be prohibited.
Not gathering in groups.
We'll stop all gatherings of more than 2 people in public.
No more than 6 people at one table.
Screw your freedom.
Life is going to continue to change.
You're under arrest in relation to incitement.
I'm in my pajamas.
What's this?
I had an ultrasound in an hour.
Yeah, she's pregnant.
In relation to a Facebook post.
Things won't go back to truly normal until we have a vaccine that we've gotten out to basically the entire world.
How about this for a sweet incentive? Krispy Kreme is offering a free glazed donut to customers who show a valid vaccination card.
Calling it Ohio Vax-A-Million, a new special lottery drawing. You just have to be 18 years or older and vaccinated.
Go get vaccinated, America.
I recommend take the vaccines.
Jennifer Aniston revealing she's cut people out of her life because they are unvaccinated.
If you're willing to walk among us unvaccinated, you are an enemy.
You can't go around pointing a gun in somebody's face, which is what it is when people are unvaccinated.
Dr. Fauci said that if hospitals get any more overcrowded, they're going to have to make some very tough choices about who gets an ICU bed. That choice doesn't seem so tough to me. Vaccinated person having a heart attack? Yes, come right on in. We'll take care of you. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo? Rest in peace, Wheezy.
It's easy to forget about the absolutely insane psychological climate of the COVID lockdowns and the bizarre behaviors that resulted from it. But what's far more important to discuss is that these behaviors were the result of psychological warfare and sophisticated behavioral modification techniques. So some of you may have heard about the Telegraph lockdown files, for example, which are just these incriminating leaked WhatsApp messages from the then UK's Health Secretary and other high-ranking government officials, where they essentially coordinate a massive campaign to weaponize fear against the unsuspecting British public. So we see over here, for example, where they suggest that they literally frighten the pants off everyone and that they ramp up fear and guilt to gain compliance. And it needs to be made very clear, guys. They didn't do this based on sound science or for some kind of greater concern for the common people. They clearly did this based on politics and concern for the ruling class. Now, although this may come as a shock to some people, the reality is that the British government had an entire team of social engineers and behavioral modification specialists that were dedicated to manipulating the British people. So when you see people acting like this, it's because they were targeted for mind control and behavioral modification. Make no mistake about it, guys. Every major government on this planet was doing the same thing. Now, for those of you that read my recent publication, you know that this goes way beyond just weaponizing fear, and that the tactics that were utilized against the unsuspecting public were in fact stringently studied during the CIA's infamous behavioral modification mind control program from over half a century ago called MK Ultra. And many of the tactics that were weaponized against us, although being much more subtle, are in fact utilized to this very day in black sites like Guantanamo Bay. This includes weaponizing fear, social isolation, sensory deprivation, and something called the Alice in Wonderland technique. So the first one is the most obvious, since anxiety and stress literally damage the brain and even endanger our physical health. Considering how so many people missed their hospital appointments or died alone because they were too scared to even leave their home, or how family members were too afraid to even touch their own loved ones, it's obvious that fear was weaponized on an unprecedented scale never before seen in human history. And then for those of us that weren't scared of the virus, we were targeted through fear in other ways, like unemployment, losing our freedoms, and even being thrown in jail. And based on the CIA's research going back 60 years in the MKUltra-inspired Q-Bark torture manual, they are well aware that sustained long enough, a strong fear of anything vague or unknown induces regression, which is to say it turns people psychologically into infants. The next tactic was social isolation, which of course was hidden behind the Orwellian language of social distancing. This too is very well known for mentally destroying people. For those of us who resisted social distancing orders, we were instead targeted through cultural isolation by being portrayed as selfish and even evil members of society that people should avoid and even unfriend. Now, referring back to the CIA's 1963 manual, social isolation is recognized as one of the key ways of, and I quote, speeding up regression to a more infantile state. And it works best when manipulating the subject's environment, cutting off human contacts, and basically controlling their perception and interpretation of reality. Now, when this is done effectively, according to the documents, the person that holds authority over the prisoner's freedom and social isolation or lockdown, like let's say somebody such as Anthony Fauci, then they become, and I quote, linked in the subject's mind with the reward of lessened anxiety and regaining access to human contact. In short, a sort of trauma bond is created, guys, where the person with the authority assumes a benevolent role. The third one is sensory deprivation, which is likewise recognized as key in inducing regression, which is a common tactic that is actually utilized in places like Guantanamo Bay, which is infamous for their use of MKUltra tactics. We also now have research that shows that face masks can severely disrupt the development of children's emotional intelligence and social skills. Beyond face masks, the 1963 manual also notes that sensory deprivation is about depriving the victim of contact with the outside world, and ultimately controlling their interpretation of reality by only allowing certain stimulation and information to enter into the target's mind. When we consider the manipulation of social media,
why do you think you or anyone else at Twitter had the medical expertise to censor a doctor's expert opinion?
Our policies regarding COVID were designed to protect individuals. We were seeing...
You guys censored Harvard-educated doctors, Stanford-educated doctors, doctors that are educated in the best places in the world, and you silenced those voices.
Compounded by the fear-mongering of the establishment media and the unending repetition of fear-mongering and propaganda, it's obvious that this was another key tactic utilized against us. And then the fourth one is something called the Alice in Wonderland tactic, which is all about dramatically manipulating the environment of the victim, which, and I quote, is designed not only to obliterate the familiar, but to replace it with the weird. And as this process continues day after day, it eventually becomes mentally intolerable. And this invariably opens up the door for behavioral modification and mind control. Now, when I see the sheer insanity of the lockdowns, the obscene gender fluidity indoctrination propaganda campaigns, naming men and women of the year and awarding them for dominating women's sports, along with the threat of nuclear war, amongst so many other things, the Alice in Wonderland tactic fits very well, guys. These encroachments are not designed to be logical or make sense. They are designed to be mentally intolerable so that they exhaust us and break us down. Now, I could take this even further and state that the ruling class almost certainly knew that by locking everyone down, this would result in higher social media usage, which ultimately results in mass sleep deprivation, which is yet another mind control tactic that was stringently studied in MKUltra and is used in Guantanamo Bay. I could also argue that they almost certainly knew that by locking everyone down, this would also result in mass drug abuse, which was also studied in MKUltra and is likewise used in Guantanamo Bay. And I could argue that the enemy in the eyes of the ruling class historically has been anybody that has challenged their authority, which today represents billions of people all around the world who are sick and tired of their shit. And because of this, we are deliberately being targeted because they fear losing power and control. But what you need to know, guys, is that this has resulted in an unprecedented 25% rise in anxiety and depression worldwide, which, to give you an actual figure, according to a study published in The Lancet, in 2020 alone, an additional 53.2 million cases of major depressive disorder globally took place, and an estimated additional 76.2 million cases of anxiety. Now, in addition to that, several several 100 million people have been pushed into poverty, which is a leading cause of premature death physically. Tens of millions have been pushed to starvation, and our children have been targeted and traumatized. And make no mistake about it, guys, the ruling class are gonna do some shit like this again. Now, with all that said, there's something very serious I'd like you to consider. During the so-called pandemic, governments, whether they were communists, capitalists, or whatever, they all worked together to weaponize fear against their populations and impose these dangerous lockdowns. The same is true of supposedly competing businesses, and together they allegedly united for the greater good of humanity by creating billions of fast-track vaccines in a matter of months, and then proceeded to get them to the most remote parts of the planet. And yet now we are told we are faced with a food crisis, an energy crisis, and a nuclear warfare crisis, all of which would undoubtedly kill far more people than any virus in human history. And yet they can't unify this time around for the greater good. And this, my friends, as George Orwell used to write about, is because they aren't really at war with one another. They are at war with us.
And in this way, guys, world war has already begun. But most people are just completely unaware.
Although I know that most of us just feel so weak and ready to give up because we literally just went through torture, and we are still going through torture because psychopaths are in power. What I'm here to remind you of is the fact that you are still alive, and the fact that you are still here, that actually means that you are incredibly strong and resilient, and you should be fucking proud of that. So whatever comes next in this great struggle between humanity and elitism, remember guys, you are being targeted, so be mindful of what could be creeping into your mind. Remember that most human beings, like dogs abused and brainwashed to fight, are only that way because somebody sinister manipulated them to be that way. Remember that regardless of skin color, politics, religion, gender, or race, the ruling class are willing to unite against us for the purpose of population control and their ethos of elitism. So there is no logical reason why we shouldn't unite together against them for the purpose of authentic freedom and our ethos of humanity. And then lastly, guys, always remember, courage does not mean that we don't feel any fear. Courage is in fact when we feel intense fear, but we recognize that there's something more important than fear, and we take action anyway. And whether that higher recognition is fighting to protect your family, opposing injustice, protecting the planet, or fighting for our children and the unborn still to come, now is the time for courage, guys.